Adab. Welcome to Islam After Colonialism, a joint webinar series by the University of Exeter and Habib University. Allow me to begin with a brief introduction to those of you who might be new to the series. Across the world, modern colonial rule has not only devastated the economies and ecologies of non-Western societies, it has dramatically transformed their cultures and traditions in innumerable ways. From the replacement of metaphysics and spirituality by historical and political religions to the emergence of divisive nationalism and nation states, the contemporary world cannot be understood without the profound impact of modern white supremacist colonial rule based on modern ideas of racial and cultural segregation, historical superiority, and the civilizing mission, as well as national competition for global power and progress. Habib University's Department of Comparative Humanities and the University of Exeter's Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies have launched a fortnightly webinar series to explore not only the radical transformation of regional Islam during the period of modern apartheid colonial rule, but also the living potentials of the pre-colonial past, as well as the urgent decolonial question of what is possible today, what can we do, and how can we live now. So there are three temporal dimensions to our series, the pre-colonial past, the colonial past, as well as a possible future. And with those brief remarks, I ask my colleague, Professor Sajjad Rizvi from the University of Exeter, to introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening.
Thank you, Nauman. And it's a pleasure, of course, to be introducing Simon Wolfgang Fuchs, who I think I first met a long time ago when he was still a grad student at Princeton, and when we were kind of having a good time in Doha at this rather strange conference. And I think what Simon is going to present today is going to really interestingly fit what we're trying to do, because he's going to look at a particular conception of the state and how we deal with it. In terms of what he's done and who he is, Simon is a lecturer in Islamic studies, or I guess an assistant professor of Islamic studies at the University of Freiburg in Germany. He's the author of In a Pure Muslim Land, which is arguably one of the most creative works on contemporary Shia Islam, certainly with focus on Pakistan, and is a very important study of Shiism in South Asia. And he's got a number of projects looking at contemporary Islam, not least, I think he's trying to put together a big project on the legacies of the revolution in Iran in 1979, and how that, in a sense, the allure of the Islamic State, which that presented, how that remains the case as well. Today, Simon is going to be presenting on the strange success, the abiding significance of the Islamic State in after colonialism, and in many ways I think it'll deal precisely with this sort of issue of how we deal with certain elements of a structural and formal politics, but also, in a sense, how it is that this idea of the Islamic State, what sort of purchase does it have actually on the ground as well? Because that's, in many ways, we've talked about our decolonial intents in this series, and it's very much looking at how do people see things from below, and how do they conceive of issues around justice and sovereignty and the good life from that perspective. So in that sense, I think I expect Simon's talk will speak directly to that. So as usual, he will speak for about half an hour, and then we will discuss the paper, and then of course open up further discussion. So without further ado, Simon, please. Begin.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sajjad, and thanks, Nauman, for hosting me today and giving me an opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this issue. And I think, Sajjad, if I'm not mistaken, we already met in 2011, and this was really my first conference as a graduate student, and I think you tore my paper apart and pointed out all the weaknesses. So I'm still traumatized from this event, but I think our relationship has not suffered, and the fact that I'm here speaks to the fact that this has healed this experience. And let's see how I will fare tonight with my presentation. Let me just share my PowerPoint that I have prepared with you. Okay, thanks so much once again. And tonight I would like to think through with you this the ongoing success of the concept of an Islamic state after colonialism in a world of nation states. And of course, we could probably say that compared with another time period, the 1980s, the excitement for this concept of an Islamic state is probably not as universal today anymore. When we look at the early 1980s, we had the Iranian Revolution of 1979. We had, of course, in Pakistan, Zia-ul Haq's Islamization policies going full speed. We also had other examples of, states that were about to Islamize, like in Sudan and other places. We had very much a Saudi response also to the Iranian challenge. And I think what sort of the atmosphere of this time period is captured nicely by the memoirs of Ziauddin Sardar, who was part of the Muslim conference circuit in the 1980s. And he puts it in this way. So what distinguished these 1980s conferences was the capital C. They were big conferences. They were lavishly accoutred with the appropriate modern paraphernalia, the bags, pens, notepads, the design concept logos, videos of and publications from, in short, an entire cottage industry. And they had a connecting buzzword, Islamization. So the revolution in Iran had inspired and frightened people across the Muslim world in equal measure, but the idea that one nation could exercise the Islamic option was a new kind of stimulus. The conferences were in many ways attempts to wrestle with that possibility while containing, directing, and managing the wilder excesses Iran had unleashed. For Muslims, the Ummah was the focus in Islamization, the program. So this was, so to speak, the high tide of this idea. You could Islamize not only the state, but also the sciences, the social sciences, the humanities. And so this was discussed at these conferences. And these efforts were directed, as I said, again, toward existing states like Pakistan, like Iran, like Sudan. There was also an attempt, or we've seen since then, attempts to create new states, most notably recently the Islamic State that tried to raise the border between Iraq and Syria, but also we've seen the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan in the 1990s. And this sort of brings me to a recent interview, which sort of emphasizes that this idea of an Islamic State is nothing that should only be relegated to the not so distant past. But in a recent interview, Mohammed Naeem, a spokesman for the Taliban's political office in Qatar and a member of its negotiation team, recently sat down with Anadolu news agency while holding these talks in Moscow. And he was asked whether the Taliban would be ready to compromise on the idea of an Islamic Emirates or the restoration of the Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan. And he said, what the future will look like, what its nature will be, these are the topics at the table. We want to reach a consensus on this, while negotiating. Of course, he put it, there is no doubt that the future system in Afghanistan will be an Islamic system. Be that as it may, our nation has sacrificed 40 years for this. Up to 99% of the people in Afghanistan are Muslim, and according to all international principles, every society, every country, every nation forms a government in line with its values. And there are many aspects we could unpack here. This quote contains all the important ingredients of an Islamic state. So he's striving, or the Taliban is striving for a system, a nizam. It's about struggle and human effort to bring this about. It's about government that should be erected. It's about certain values and rights and laws that they call upon. And what all of these projects have in common when we look at ideas of an Islamic state since the second half of the 20th century are mixed degrees of defensiveness and also self-confidence at the same time. So a self-perception as offering a true alternative. In the past, this was then often framed in the way of a third path between capitalism and communism and breaking sort of the hands of Western and Eastern imperialism. Today, it's more often directed against sort of this the threat of secularism, and has very much to do with the aspiration of creating something new. And we also see this, this is very much playing out in the Iranian Revolution as well, where the slogan is, neither East nor West, but an Islamic Republic. And I think this sort of self-confidence of these projects that we also see here coming out, what sort of the Taliban spokesman offered, is quite in contrast with earlier attempts, or attempts that still fall sort of in the decolonization early phase, so to speak, where an Islamic state with a global reach was not so much on the agenda, but it was more a concept that had to do with self-preservation, with the idea of hoping to preserve a certain Muslim way of life. And when you take one example from the subcontinent, for example, is Kazim Razavi and the Majlis-e-Ittihad-e-Muslimin in Hyderabad, Deccan. So they tried to preserve the independence of Hyderabad under the Nizam's rule, that it wouldn't accede to the Indian Republic. And in their attempts, also of their program since 1946, was to safeguard the Islamic culture in the Deccan. They wanted to resist any modification of the Muslim character of Hyderabad's rule. So when you joined this organization as a volunteer, you would pledge your life to the leader, to Razavi, and fight to the last to maintain the supremacy of Muslim power in the Deccan. So under Razavi, the Hyderabadi state was seen as an Islamic state, the Nizam, the ruler, being the representative and symbol of sovereignty that applied to the Muslim community and which he exercised on their behalf, so to speak. And we could also point out other earlier examples when we look at the Ottoman Empire since the second half of the 19th century, and especially after it had lost most of its European provinces. Sort of the call for Islam was really more meant as a tool to shore up solidarity, and was not meant really as something to reach out and really beyond the borders, even though some states responded to this in this regard. So how has the concept of an Islamic state managed to ride the tide of political thought in the 20th century? Why has this idea become so powerful, and how did it get turned into an almost utopian vision and a promise to restructure society, to redeem it from its ills, and to also care for the needs of the poor and the downtrodden? So I'm less interested in this talk to explore early Islam, the example of the Prophet Muhammad, and early Muslim experiences of politics, and whether Iran is inherently more political than other religions. If you're interested in such a discussion, you could, for example, engage with Michael Cook's book, Ancient Religion, Modern Politics, where he tries to compare various religious traditions. And in his perception, sort of, we could think of various religious traditions as sort of a menu from which people or believers can choose, and they can sort of make a certain selection. That is to say, as Michael Cook writes, an ancient religion, like a menu, provides its modern adherents with a set of options that do not determine their choices, but do constrain them. And in his argument, the caliphate is a distinct Muslim invention, so to speak, a powerful antidote to the sense of geopolitical deprivation that furthers a sense of Muslim unity, invokes a component of the religious tradition that is associated with a glorious past. But today the caliphate is not so much on our menu, but more the nation state and what this has to do with this idea of an Islamic state. And I would like to talk about 5 aspects of the strange success, as I've termed it during the course of my talk. First of all, I would like to briefly talk about the silence of tradition, the intrusive nature of the post-colonial state, the contingencies of generating momentum for an Islamic state, the aspirational power of realizing the new, and the enduring appeal and sacralization of Islamic law. And I will also try to unpack all of this and tell you what I mean by these different aspects. When we come to the first aspect, the silence of tradition, So as a casual observer, one should assume that since Islam is so much identified with political rule, also political thought would have been high on the agenda of many Muslim authors in the past. And when one delves more deeply into classic writings, then it becomes obvious that this is not really the case, or at least not the case to the extent that one would expect. When you take, for example, one book that I have I've shown you the cover here, the Ahkam al-Sultaniya by Abul Hassan Ali bin Muhammad al-Marwardi, who died in 1058. So this was the first work really to collect rules pertaining to government into one single book. And he's often described as a pragmatist, someone who's willing to sacrifice the idea of the caliphate. He spelled out the characteristics of the caliph or the leader of the ummah, but more pertaining to his political abilities, not so much to his personal characteristics and whether he was really a good Muslim. And he could envision several ways how a caliphate comes into power. He could be designated by his predecessor. There is this complicated body of the people of losing and binding, the Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd, so they could come together and choose him, or he could also attain his office by usurpation. And all of these pathways are equally valid. Other authors of the 11th century wrote similar tracts. Another author called Abu Yala, who died in 1066, wrote a book with the same title. And he, for example, put that the common people don't even need to know whom they pledge allegiance to, because it's just important that they know someone rules over them. Or Al-Juwayni, another important figure from the 11th century, he would, the main characteristics that he saw important for a Muslim leader would be someone who has kifaya, who gets things done, and who is an effective ruler. And Patricia Krone, in discussing Islamic political thought, sums this up in a way that these theorists never really spell out in detail the procedure for removing a ruler, because, as she writes, the Sunnis wanted to have their cake and eat it. There had to be a point where even a quasi-caliph, not to mention a mere king, forfeited his position, but it was best not to specify where and how, so as not to create an obligation to take action. And one of the arguments that I would like to make today is that due to these unclear and rather vague requirements, it has proven fairly easy for Islamist thinkers in the 20th century to cite this classic tradition and to make the case that they are in line with what these earlier theorists have said, and to step in the void and fill it out with their own ideas of an Islamic state. The second aspect that I would like to talk about is the intrusive nature of the post-colonial state. And here, of course, important or brilliant colleagues have written extensively about these aspects. So to a certain extent, it has become obvious that even a secular state is not disinterested in religion, but of course, drawing boundaries and defining what is religious and what not the entire time. Saba Mahmood, in her important book, Religious Difference in a Secular Age, makes the very insightful comparison between secular courts, for example, in Egypt and in Europe, that come to rather similar conclusions when they have to decide on the status of minorities, be it the Baha'is in Egypt or Muslim minorities in Europe. Discussions on the headscarf, on whether the cross on the wall of a school is only a cultural symbol, not a religious symbol, the fate of Baha'is in Egypt, and whether they can put their religion on an identity card. And the interesting thing is when we compare the modern post-colonial also state in the Middle East or in South Asia with, once again, for example, the Ottoman Empire, where we see a rather relaxed attitude towards the Sharia and towards Islamic law, because there Islamic law was more meant as an assurance for the population that the stable system of justice would prevent extreme cases of anarchy and oppression. And also non-Muslims took readily advantage of the system. So we have numerous examples of for example, non-Muslims also using Sharia courts that had more possibilities to enforce their rulings. And the ulama went along with this. They gave a lot of leeway to the political authorities for mundane legal regulations. There was for example, siyasa, the right of the ruler to punish servants charged with imperial administration. There was discretionary punishment in cases that were not punishable according to specific requirements of the Sharia. There was also the ruler's law, the Qanun, developed in these areas to regulate and manage the empire's population more effectively. And it was rather rare that Qanun explicitly went against the Sharia. There were some cases like when, in the Ottoman succession, a new sultan would usually murder his brothers as potential political rivals, or also this issue of the devshirme, of sort of collecting and converting usually Christian boys that became a part of the Ottoman army. But this was also most of the time justified by istihsan, by this legal tool of juristic discretion, which also made this possible. And when we compare this with the Turkish Republic, after the end of the Ottoman Empire under Atatürk, then we see a very different interest in managing Islam by the state. So as Atatürk, for example, put it, the faith of Islam should be purified and raised from the political situation in which it has been put for centuries. So he made this distinction between a pure Islam that is non-political and sort of a polluted Islam that really has to be weeded out. So the charge of being a reactionary, of the charge of following reactionism became a weapon against opposition in the early Republican period. And those who fought against reactionary Islam were also labeled as martyrs when they died in their cause. For example, there was a famous incident in the 1930s when a soldier was killed by supposedly reactionary villagers, and then this monument that was inaugurated in 1934 in the so-called Menenem incident was then labeled as being now the Kaaba of the new Turkish Republic. So a lot of Islamic vocabulary was used, but in the interest of the secularizing the state. And the goal was to eliminate what they termed superstition in religion to secure freedom of conscience. And a lot of these supposedly irrational ideas were coming from, as they put it, from the Arabic heritage that had to be weeded out. When we compare this to Pakistan, the situation there is not so different. For example, when you consider Jinnah's Eid message of 1945 in the run-up to Pakistan, here it's telling that he said, our prophet enjoined us that every Muslim should possess a copy of the Quran and be his own priest. So there's also an effort to sideline clerical authority. And later in the early history of the Pakistani state, modernist thinkers were very much willing to play along with certain strategies of the state to redefine Islam in a way that was suitable to the purpose of the state. So I've brought you here a picture of Fazlur Rahman, who also is on the record of writing, Islam is a charter for interference in society, and this charter gives to the collective institution of society, the government, the right and duty to constantly watch, give direction, and actually mold the social fabric. So he then also produced Quranic justifications for press and media censorship that were readily put to use then by the government of Ayub Khan, for example. And this brings me to an earlier point that I have made, sort of this appreciation of the medieval tradition for rulers who get things done. And this is also something that was seized upon by Islamist thinkers who were pushing for the idea of divine sovereignty. So I will get to this in a second, but sort of what Fazlur Rahman stands for is something that Nathan Brown has recently also called a state Islam. So those institutions whose staff is on the state payroll, but have some kind of religious task to perform. So there's a common mentality among many of these, in the 20th century, many of these religious scholars and state bureaucrats and also prayer leaders who are trying to justify the existing political system as legitimate, and that the ruler and the entire government, the political system, could count as Wali al-Amr, as the guardian of the community. This is nothing sort of in the distant past. These efforts of creating state Islam, just consider a more recent example in the United Arab Emirates, that in 2018 established a fatwa council. Its head is the Mauritanian scholar Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya, who acts as the sort of unofficial Grand Mufti of the United Emirates. And he recommended himself for this position by already in 2008 spelling out that there's a fatwa crisis, that there are too many sort of problematic fatwas that condone violence, and it's really necessary that experienced muftis need to work with Muslim states in order to train a new generation of Islamic scholars in order to do away with this situation. So, but what does all of this that I have now dwelt on at some length to do with an Islamic state? So, of course, many of Islamist thinkers in the 20th century, they would reject these secular projects that Atatürk or Fazlur Rahman stand for, but they were all very much in love with the power of the modern state. So Maududi, for example, in the context of Pakistan, is like Fazlur Rahman very much interested in the fact that a modern state can order individual behavior. As Maududi put it, the 19th century vision of the state is now utterly outdated. The state is no longer outside of society. Now the state's arena has almost become as all-encompassing as that of deen, sort of, or as that of religion. So Maududi saw an immense potential in the state as a vehicle of individual moral transformation, and thought that the evils which are not eradicated through the preaching of the Quran need the coercive power of the state to eradicate them. And here we see sort of an affinity with this idea of the medieval political Islamic tradition, that a ruler should get things done. And especially Maududi is someone who pushed for divine sovereignty as an idea that the state needs to implement, that has become really a staple not only of Islamist thought, but in sort of a global Muslim context, that many Muslims would also appreciate sort of this, or see this as a self-evident aspect of what a state should do. That the state should implement Islamic law and should implement God's sovereignty on earth. Let me come to my next shorter points. Sorry, this was just a slide denoting Maududi that I should have chosen earlier. I think it would be really interesting when you do a more global and transnational comparison of the idea of the nations of the Islamic State to compare the usual timelines, because I think there's an interesting difference in this regard between the Middle East and South Asia. For the Middle East, there is sort of an established timeline that after the Second World War, Arab nationalism reigned supreme, especially under Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, who was successful in the Suez crisis. The Suez Canal has been very much in our discussions recently, and sort of 1956 being the height of Arab nationalism, then sort of its abrupt downfall with the loss of the Arab armies against Israel in 1967, and later also socialist ideologies becoming discredited, with Arab states in the region shifting to more liberal ways of structuring their economy, and then sort of an Islamic revival sets in. But of course, in Pakistan, we have a very different timeline that is often seen as important in this regard. So there are several dates, I think, that are seen as important in solidifying this idea of an Islamic state. Very important is, of course, in 1949, the Objectives Resolution that was supposed to enable Muslims enable Muslims to order their lives in the individual and collective spheres in accordance with the teachings and requirements of Islam. That was then also made a preamble of the constitution. We could also think of the 1951 Ulama Assembly in Karachi that sort of agreed on 22 aspects of an Islamic state. We could also think of the 1973 constitution and the repugnancy clause that all existing laws should be brought in conformity with the injunctions of Islam. We could also think, of course, of Zia's coup d'etat in 1977 and the ensuing Islamization then. And we could think of the Iran Revolution of 1979. That is probably an interesting sort of shared element between the Middle East and South Asia in order to sort of push for this momentum of demanding an Islamic state. And the Objectives Resolution in particular was very much important for the Jamaat-e-Islami because, given Maududi's well-known opposition to the Pakistan project, then he could reconcile himself with Pakistan. And after its passing, all forms of relationship with the state became then permissible in the context of Pakistan. Not so much in India, where the Jamaat-e-Islami struggled for many decades how to relate to the political system. Let me come to two final issues in order also to come to an end and not to extend this too long. I think what's also really interesting in the context of Pakistan in particular, and I guess many projects of an Islamic state, is really this issue of newness. So Navida Khan has demonstrated the aspirational characteristic of Muslim reform that is especially tied to the project of Pakistan, to thinkers as diverse as Iqbal, Muhammad Asad, and Maududi, who all thought, the conditions are bad and we need to get out of these and we need to help Muslims to order their life and open their vision for the future. So these aspirational aspects also of what Pakistan could bring about. And Liaquat Ali Khan, who was also instrumental for the Objectives Resolution, also once again sort of espouses this idea of a spirit of enabling, making Pakistan available for such a life, producing the rightful environment within it rather than entailing. So as he put it, Pakistanis should find freedom to set up a polity which may prove to be the laboratory for the purpose of demonstrating to the world that Islam is not only a progressive force in the world, but it also provides remedies for many of the ills from which humanity has been suffering. And I think the power of this idea and these aspirational capacities should not be disregarded. When we read on the early history of Pakistan, this comes to the fore quite often. Just take, just a random example, this 1948, December 5th, 1948, New York Times article where the correspondent traveled by car for 2 weeks through Pakistan. And he describes this, he really felt that there was a feeling of newness about Pakistan, whereas free India with her crumbling monuments and her preoccupation with tradition never lets one forget the weight of the past centuries. So that's sort of an interesting aspect of looking at Pakistan that has also been noted by many different observers. Just take, for example, Konstantinos Doxiadis in the way that he envisioned Islamabad when he traveled to the area and to Pakistan to find appropriate architectural models on how to design Islamabad. He narrates a walking tour he made through Peshawar, concluding with this statement: "It is the old Victoria monument, but the statue of Victoria is not there anymore. It has been taken away since partition. is it not symbolic of the situation we have to face? Has not Pakistan reached the moment at which it has overthrown the old symbols, but has not yet created the new ones? Has not Pakistan reached the moment when it has to abandon the old type models of its town and villages and replace them with something new, something through which, which has not yet been created? And finally, the fifth aspect that I would like to point out in my talk before concluding is that I think what also makes, beyond sort of these four aspects that I have elaborated on, I think what also contributed to the ongoing appeal of an Islamic state is also that the understanding of Islamic law has also undergone very much a transition from the pre-colonial period. For example, when you look at Ahmed Fikri Ibrahim's work on Egypt, pragmatism in Islamic law, it becomes obvious that Islamic law is really a living and rather mundane entity that people encounter every day, so that they also encounter in sales contracts, in all aspects of their lives, and which also means that they have no problem, for example, in forum shopping, so that they, even though their religion or their affiliation, they might be Hanafis, but if it's conducive for a sales contract, then you might switch, or you might go to a Hanbali judge because you can get a better deal in this regard. And of course, this means that there is a much more pragmatic and relaxed atmosphere in relating to Islamic law, and this is nothing that colonial states could really accept, and could accept that this continues, because the pre-modern Sharia has been predominantly a jurist's law and sort of a private affair of individuals. Even a murder was sort of a private conflict between two families, for example, where the state wasn't really involved. And the state sort of then intervened and tried to pull this into its own purview, because it could not really accept this. And so this means that Sharia since the colonial period has often been reduced, of course, to a personal status law. This is also the way how Jinnah, for example, understood Sharia, and Muslims encounter Sharia mostly then in the purely religious sphere, relating to fasting, praying, all these sorts of things. And I would argue that this has also meant that law itself has lost much of its mundane and more sort of pragmatic characteristics, and has been really lifted up to being something that is very much theological and spiritual. And for this reason, it also fits very much with this attempt at Islamization, that this has become really the buzzword that Ziauddin Sardar called it in his sort of estimation or his narration of the conference circuit. So to conclude, I would like to argue that the success is perhaps not so strange, but has many fathers and mothers, some of which I have tried to elucidate in my talk. I've focused on 5 different aspects, and I would of course be very curious to hear your thoughts and comments. So I've tried to make the case that the continuing appeal of the concept of an Islamic state after colonialism has to do with the silence of the Muslim tradition, the intrusive nature of the post-colonial state, also some exigencies that depend from place to place on how momentum was generated for an Islamic state. The Pakistani case is in this context particularly interesting because it has this aspirational characteristic of creating something completely new that has no connection with the old. And I think the success of the idea of an Islamic state is ultimately tied also to the enduring appeal and sacralization of Islamic law that was lifted from an all-encompassing system with many mundane worldly aspects to something which pertains mostly then to the sovereignty of God and really becomes lifted on a pedestal, so to speak. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts.
Thanks so much for that, Simon. Very illuminating talk. Really resonant themes of social engineering, utopianism, which are so modern. One of the questions I have actually is about the fact that somebody like you who works in the field, or Sajjad, or some of the other people who've been on our program. Of course, other people have also illuminated, for instance, and I think it always deserves reminding that the usage of the very word Islam and Islamic, Islam and Islami is totally new and has very little to do with the way the word is used even in the Quran. I always remind my students, just look at Platts from 1884, where the word Islami actually occurs also as a noun, not as an adjective, which would be unrecognizable to Urdu-speaking people today. Islami as a noun meaning Muslim. So first of all, to point out that in fact this usage in general is ever changing, and it's really quite dramatic in the case of Islam and Islamic. So this is for the benefit of the audience. But what I wanted to ask you was, we're in this very strange situation in we who are living in these times, where on the one hand, we know people like us who spend time reading a lot of books and investigating these matters and thinking hard about it and conceptualizing and unconceptualizing. But for most people, this is not really possible. It's not really possible to undertake such investigations. And these categories have now been so normalized and naturalized. And there's just such a web of concepts, institutions, ideas, so our entire reality, in fact, because if one, just as you point out, the nation state, the post-colonial nation state, well, the modern state, whether it's the post-colonial state or not, starting with the absolutist state, followed by the nation state, and then later in the post-colonial nation state, the nation state has kinds of powers which would have been unimaginable. The modern state has kinds of powers which would have been unimaginable to states of the past, no matter how powerful you might think of emperors and empires. So I wonder what hope is there of persuading people, in general, of the fact that things are so dramatically different. So on the one hand, we moderns take for granted that we're entirely different from people of the past, just by virtue of being modern. But on the other hand, we insist upon this continuity. Of course, what else could you do? So it's not as if you can forfeit the past. The past doesn't just disappear. So what hope is there that even we've been doing this program for months now. It's a small effort. It gets a lot of viewership and lots of people are very appreciative. But really, in the end, it's like a drop in the ocean.
Yeah, I mean, Nauman, I think I was struck by an article I read recently by Nikki Keddy, who wrote a very essayistic impression of her travels in the wider Muslim world, as she put it, in 1985. And she was in Nigeria, and she went to Malaysia, and she was in Pakistan and Iran. And it's interesting to see that sort of her estimate at this time is really that, this whole call for Islamization and, political Islam in power has really disillusioned people. And she thinks, within a couple of years, this has now been tried. And you see that this has really not benefited the poor in the way that it should be. And so for this reason, it's something that will just pass. And that's sort of interesting that we are having this discussion, many years later, and sort of these aspects, what many, I mean, for me, it's really interesting when you look at the early 1980s after the Iranian Revolution, where I feel that also Sunni Islamists, sort of one of the things that they took away from the Iranian Revolution was precisely this issue that the social question is once again on the table, that they should learn from the communists, that they should really develop a real interest for the situation of the workers and the poor, and that this is at the forefront of the Islamic State. And you could also argue that, of course, the Iranian state has delivered in some ways on this promise. So this is also one of the reasons why it is still there, I guess, why, even though there's a lot of resistance, of course, and a lot of issues that also have to do with sanctions and many other problems that Iran is facing. But I guess this sort of social contract, so to speak, or the, extending healthcare to the villages, for example, was really something that made the regime originally quite successful. And I guess this is maybe one dimension also of this whole issue of, an Islamic State that has somehow then also been sidelined or been lost, or in the case of Pakistan, I mean, you know this much better, but I guess this was never really so much at the forefront of trying to create sort of a more of a Muslim welfare state. And maybe it could have really gone down also in this direction. So sorry, I'm not sure whether there's much hope, but I wonder whether you think that this could have ever been a viable option, or why this has really not been, this has not materialized to the way it could have been.
Actually, there were a lot of socialists. I mean, even the Communist Party, as you know, supported the Pakistan movement, thanks to Stalin's opinions on the question of national self-determination. I mean, in the early years, in fact, the socialists were really dominant in the public sphere, in newspapers, etc. So there was that possibility. I think there were lots and lots of different things happened as a result of which, of course, to add to what you were saying, I think it's also the case that simply because Muslims are also, Muslims especially, of course, all post-colonial peoples or non-Western peoples are thought to be living in the past, right? And of course, people in the post-colonial world also think that they are living in the past and they need to modernize, etc. So that adds to the idea that, of course, these ideas are traditional ideas. So I think the problem of recognition, I think, first of all, comes from this idea that we are living in the past, in the non-Western world. The recognition, first of all, that we are in fact modern would go some way towards making these developments that you're talking about more visible. Yeah. Thank you for that. I'll ask Sajjad now.
Yeah, I mean, lots of things come to mind. I guess, one of the interesting questions which you raise from this is that it seems that there's, on the one hand, this kind of constant crisis of legitimacy and authenticity, alongside a generationally repeated kind of oblivion of what happened, right? So, there's a debate which happens in the late 40s, early 50s, and then we seem to forget it. I'm talking about Pakistan. And then you have this debate in the early 70s, and again, people forget it. And then you have the Zia's early 80s, you forget it again. And then suddenly you have this kind of strange, hyper-modern PTI government in the current period, where it's going back exactly the same questions, right? It's as if, the ghost of Maududi keeps on coming and biting you and not kind of going away. So that seems to be, I think, maybe at the core of it, that it's something to do with the way in which a post-colonial state, but perhaps even the modern kind of nation state, has this enduring issue of legitimacy and authenticity, which is, as you at one point you said, the Islamists had this idea of the state and the society and the deen being all kind of identified with each other, and in some ways that is very much the modern political problem. It's as true of Europe as it is of anywhere else, that how does the state relate to the society? Are they the same? And then are they the way in which we might identify and underpin that, through some sort of political theology, is that also identical to it? So whether it's an idea of Europe or an idea of a certain kind of history, an idea of exceptionalism, where in Britain, for example, we're stuck in this rut of people being obsessed with this idea that Britain is special, right? That Britain has to, as someone tweeted this morning, that Britain always has to be a beacon to the world, which is widely shared. So that's that kind of anxiety of that legitimacy which lies at the heart of it. And then, of course, then you have I guess the wider question, which is, I mean, what do they even mean by this Islamic State? What is the real difference, say, between the Jamaat-e-Islami's conception of the Islamic State and, for example, the Ayub Khan experiment of State Islam with Fazl Rahman? Because it would seem to me that in practice, if it's about the state controlling and defining Islam, then it's the same end, really, isn't it? So, how is it really that different? And I guess the last question I want to ask you, which is kind of an obvious one, which is, the elephant in the room, which is Wael Halaq, right? So Wael Halaq is often the elephant in the room, especially in our conversations, but especially with his argument about the impossible state. Why is it that people have not become convinced by this argument, right? That that this desire for the Islamic State is completely futile and silly. It's just not possible. So yeah, I think that's probably enough to take the conversation forward.
Yeah, thanks, Sajjad. I mean, do you think that Wael Halaq's argument could have maybe resonated more also with the public and sort of become something that simply would have been taken up also in public discourse if he had painted a more or less sort of idealized picture of pre-modern Islamic society, where sort of the Sharia pervaded everything and where sort of, political power was always checked and there were no transgressions. And sort of, I think hasn't this really undermined sort of the argument, this effort to overcompensate maybe in this regard, and not also to sort of see pre-modern Muslims also as faulty human beings who, might have, of course, striven for an Islam, like sort of these values of the Sharia, but it would have fallen short. I hope I don't, would be utterly too harsh on pre-modern Muslims, but I just think that this conception makes it a little bit tricky to appreciate some of the arguments in this book. But I guess what I wanted to ask you, and the two of you, and this has been on my mind for a lot of my research, to what extent you would buy also these, when we talk about, also ideas on the ground, Nauman, as you put it in the beginning also, that this is also an interest in our discussion series here, to what extent these aspirational qualities and the sense of newness, what Pakistan could bring about, whether you think this is also a similarly dangerous construction that maybe historians work with, but it was never really experienced in the past. So I've given you some sort of, more random examples, but I would also be curious to hear your thoughts in this regard, and whether you think there was ever this power to this idea, or whether ideas in this regard ever really mattered, given what we have all said about the power of the state, and that this was put to use in maybe, or looking in a very different direction.
In the past, when?
So of course we have 1949, so the spirit of the objectives resolution, and then it's a good question. So when does this end? So this is, I guess, also a question that I have grappled with, and to what extent sort of this sense of excitement was ever there, and when did it vanish, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. It seems to be around still. I mean, I don't think that it's vanished. It seems to be, even though it might be, I mean, isn't Imran Khan's, actually, I think, Imran Khan got his New Medina from Dhulipala. So maybe he got it from Dhulipala, right? The New Medina book. Isn't Imran Khan's whole program, I mean, it's very shallow, but I don't think any of these ideas of creating an Islamic state have all that much depth, even in the past, huh?
But isn't the question more that, why is it that people have not been convinced by the failures, right? So yes, of course, there's been this kind of excitement, and there was no doubt there was excitement at the beginning of the whole sort of Pakistan movement, and those who basically fell for that idea, or the kind of Islamic socialism of Bhutto, or this idea of Islamization, etc. I mean, why, or Maududi himself in the Jamaat, I mean, why is it that people just have not been convinced that this stuff has come up again and again, this idea of Nizam Mustafa, or the New Medina? This is not a new idea. So why is it not implicated in the failures of the past? Would I guess be my kind of question. Why is it that kind of mobilizing on the finality of the Prophet and the kind of political chaos and mob rule that it brings? I mean, this has happened periodically since the 1950s. So why is it that people haven't seen that, if you go down this route, politically you get a mess, but also socially it ends up with people getting killed. So to me, this is a complete sort of completely strange situation that people do not kind of cotton on to that. So for me, it's not that the pre-moderns are stupid. It's the moderns are stupid.
Right.
It's quite obvious to me that it's not the question of the pre-moderns. It's really about, what the hell is going on with the moderns.
Well, actually, it's not that different from, all these other modern programs, like, I mean, the structural adjustment programs, which have devastated society after society. And even people, in the World Bank have said that, it's a disaster. But of course, they continue to apply the same formulae. And I think, it's the same goes for Marxism. Yeah, all kinds of modern projects, despite the, really spectacular failures. And I think, the evidence is all around us, both in terms of the free market. Look at the disasters that the free market has caused, as well as, quote unquote communism. They've also created tremendous disasters, but it doesn't stop people from trying to do the same thing all over again. I think that's partly, just a result of abstraction and rationalism. Yeah, this particular modern form of rationalism, which is impervious to experience. Yeah, experience is not something that. First of all, people don't have experience, as I was arguing recently in the talk that I gave in the conference we had last week. experience just goes right through them. Yeah. So I think it's very much this problem that you're talking about. I think is very much in line with all of these other projects. Failure, of course, one can only recognize failure if one experiences failure. So if one doesn't experience it and it just washes right through, right over one, then how can one learn?
Right. So I think it's hard to add something to, but still the question that Sajjad also raised, given that you said we had many other modern projects that have tried and have failed to a certain extent, and they, of course, we still have certain groups that push for another communist revolution, but they are rather marginal to a certain extent. But at the same time, it still seems that the embers of the Islamic State, there's still sort of a promise that can be kindled. And I wonder whether this really, what makes this then sort of special, and who is sort of responsible then for this. And sort of I've presented some ideas in this regard, but I would also be curious how you two would see this.
I mean, another thing which struck me is, going back to this question of, what's the difference between the Islamic State and State Islam? I mean, one of the elements of the attraction could be the fact that people can point to certain examples of State Islam which are considered to be successful in the kind of modern progressive way, right? So, for example, people point to Turkey, or they point to Malaysia, or they point to the UAE. These are kind of heavenly paradise for people within a South Asian context in particular, and somehow perhaps their success is projected as this kind of eternal Islamic State, because even the I think one thing which is perhaps important to recognize is that not everyone realizes that the idea of the Islamic State is a modern one, right? So there's a sense in which there's a continuity. So when people in Pakistan, I mean, this is a caricature and sort of tongue-in-cheek, but they look at Erdogan and they look at Ertugrul, right? And for in their minds, this is kind of continuity of a Turkish way of doing Islam and of running a polity, and it's all about kind of fighting the good fight and defending the faith and so forth. And then that kind of becomes a successful model of what an Islamic State is. And previous kind of nationalist ideas of relations between, say, Turkey and Pakistan are forgotten in this fog of Islamic stately brotherhood in a very different kind of way. So I think maybe that could be it. And as I said, I do keep on coming back to this thing of, how do we think of this relationship between the Islamic State and State Islam? And how one can be packaged as the other quite successfully, depending on who you're presenting it to.
I mean, I could imagine sort of one of the issues that are maybe also a problem in scholarship, that State Islam has really often been also dismissed as sort of feeble attempts at sort of shoring up legitimacy for certain regimes, and this is sort of bound to result in failure, and people can look through all of this. But I guess this has probably also really not done justice that I guess many of these proponents of State Islam have also been rather, have also not been these pliable tools, but have also been successful in navigating this position and maybe carving out certain spaces of autonomy for themselves. So I could imagine maybe also the sort of the privileging Islamist actors who have not been in power and not really paying attention to these aspects of State Islam could also explain why, I guess, for a long time this has been dismissed and not really taken as seriously what this does, to societies and on a broader scale, I could imagine as well.
I also think that once this idea of history, as Reinhard Koselleck calls it, of history as a collective singular totality, yeah, collective singular totality. Now, this is something that is assumed in all institutions of the state, modern state. That whatever the nation is the collective singular totality. History, I mean, both at the global level as well as at the national level, you have people. This is how people think of history. This is how they think of national history. So once, and it's really difficult to dislodge it. So even I mean, try persuading people that Islam in the past didn't mean what it means today. Islam today, as starting with Cantwell Smith down to Fesavdevji and other people, of course, many people have pointed out that in the modern period, Islam functions as precisely this collective singular totality and a historical collective singular. So, I mean, the persistence, I mean, it's axiomatic. Yeah, it's axiomatic to all of these institutions, thought frameworks, conceptual frameworks. I think that is responsible for its persistence. Yeah?
So, Nauman, would you then think that maybe a more social history approach and case studies of interactions, and maybe also, that sort of dislodge the idea of the ideal of the pre-modern Muslim couldn't help in this regard? Do you think sort of this historical anthropology that could flesh out sort of the human contingencies also of the past could really help, or is this something that you have in mind?
Yeah, and extensive histories of usage, which of course are part of social histories and cultural histories, so that people are able to develop a real sense of these other potentialities within the word. I mean, that's of course the other problem in the modern period, is that we have a very particular relationship to language. We tend to think of words as being monosemic, or meaning one thing. So all of the potentialities within a word are obscured, if not outright occluded, or banned, really. I think, yes, social histories, if people had a much more rich sense of the usage of the word, yeah, readily accessible, that would help.
I think what might be useful to that is to actually understand how, historically, especially in the 20th century and after, Islam has been used to mobilize, right? So, going back, for example, to the Khilafat movement, the Ghadar movement, obviously the Pakistan movement itself, the agitations, the anti-Ahmadi agitations, the whole question of an Islamic Republic, etc. How movements like this sort of the kind of the hyper-Barelvi movement, the Tehreek works, etc. I mean, I think some of those elements perhaps need to be brought out a bit more. I mean, obviously we do have a certain set of anthropological, sociological studies of that, but that would maybe kind of, I think, give us some of the data that we want, some of the qualitative data in terms of how we see that developing, and how the usage of Islam, and different signifiers like the Prophet, etc., works within that. Yeah, so that's really kind of appeal to going back to looking at things on the ground, because it certainly seems a lot of the debates that we have, about this early, Pakistan opportunity, the objectives of revolution, etc., is very much a very limited elite study of what's going on in a very small sort of select group of people, but did it have any purchase in the wider society? Was there, what was going on in the press? What was going on more broadly? Were there poems written about it? I don't know. Was there any? Was there a ghazal to the objectives resolution? I mean, that would be, rather disturbing at many levels, but you never know. I mean, ghazals have been used for worse reasons than the objective resolution, so why not? So I think maybe it's partly kind of us really thinking about what the possibilities are of this data that we have and the subject of inquiry, because I think there's a lot of possibilities of how we might look at that sort of material.
So I was thinking, so when the 1857 rebellion happens, so you have both Muslims and Hindus rise up, and they mobilize in the name of Deen and Dharm, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. They don't say Islam. I mean, they certainly wouldn't say Hinduism. That would not be, despite Kangana Ranaut's recent role as Rani of Jhansi. I don't think that's quite an accurate representation of the historical Rani of Jhansi. So Deen and Dharm, because of course especially post 1813, the colonial state was also an evangelical state. So in response to that, they rose in the name of Deen and Dharm. And the interesting thing about Deen and Dharm, of course, as opposed to Islam and Hinduism or Hindus and Muslims, is that Deen can be translated into Dharm and Dharm can be translated into Deen. Deen is equal to Dharm and Dharm is equal to Deen. Whereas obviously Hindu is not equal to Muslim. And the next time they rose up, which was in the early 20th century, thanks to everything that had intervened between 1857 and the early 20th century, including the colonial census, all of these colonial surveys, not to mention all kinds of colonial institutions, etc. So the next time they rose up, they rose up with these modern religio-political identities, within the space of a half century. But they didn't in 1857 rise in the name of Islam. It was Deen rather than Islam, right?
I think it depends. But then, I mean, it also depends on how kind of fluid you think some of these terms are. So even if there was an appeal to Islam in danger, and for example, certainly, the so-called work of Fazl-e-Haq Khairabadi on the, the, what's it called, Baghavat Hind, or the Risala Ghadiriya, as it's called as well. I mean, he certainly talks about this idea of kind of Islam being under threat. Whether he necessarily means the same thing that we would perhaps nowadays mean. I mean, I think he means a very simple sort of notion of the threat to just the basic practice and fulfillment of the duties that a person has as a religious believer. So in that sense, it's not necessarily an abstract idea. It's more like, what it is that Muslims as people do that seems to be under threat with this new kind of colonial state. So I think but then that's kind of, what we're trying to look at generally, which is how it is that this term Islam builds up different resonances over time, and how that shifts from that period of, you have an empire, you have a colonial state, but you don't necessarily have formal empire at that point. It happens immediately after the sort of crushing of the revolt. So yeah, I mean, I think that could be one element of it. But yeah, I think maybe poetry might be something to look at. That's your next next project for you, Simon, after the journals, go to the poetry. But you know, I mean, if we take something go back to the Iranian Revolution, right? So, I mean, one of the things also that the revolution does is it, within the Shi'i context in Pakistan and also in South Asia, it fundamentally transforms the way they look at the world, right? So, you know, this classic slogan, which I'm fairly convinced is not pre-revolution, in Persian, you know, Islam Nabi Muhammadi, seems to be like become a timeless idea of the way things are supposed to be, and that becomes directly associated with this notion of Vilayat al-Faqih. And that somehow becomes internalized by so many people. It's so much so that it's probably the prevalent position amongst the Shia in South Asia now, that this is obviously the way things should be. And even as a minority in which you can never have a Vilayat al-Faqih state in Pakistan, for example, that somehow there has to be some recognition of this. So as something that one is associated with. And that strikes me as being very, very bizarre. It reminds me of a conversation a long time ago I had in the midst of a lot of the anti-Shia killing, where someone said to me, yeah, you know, it's fine to bring, you know, prosecutions and cases in courts, etc. But what's really absolutely fundamental is people need to recognize the authority of Khamenei. And I couldn't even begin to know how to respond to that, because it seemed like such a bizarre idea to me. So, you know, that kind of transformation and the, you know, the point at which 79 becomes significant in different communities is really, really important, I think. Mm. And at that level, that is something, that's an external idea. And people are not entirely attuned to the failures of 79. Right. Because it's not something that they've personally necessarily experienced in the way that they might have experienced Zia's Islamization and other things. Or even maybe the failure of the Shia political parties in Pakistan. Right. I mean, of course, Islam Nabi Muhammadi is, of course, also an effort trying to reach out to Sunnis to a certain extent and present something that is not Shi'i tinge, so to speak, but, you know, speaking of pure Islam that is accessible to everyone. But I mean, in preparing for this talk, I realized that as far as at least political Islam and these ideas of the Islamic State are concerned, I really feel that there's that there could be potentially a productive comparison between these moments that are, you know, Sajjad, you mentioned that the objectives resolution and other things, it's of course to a certain extent a stale debate. I mean, that's similar to the intentions of Jinnah. It's you know, every article on religious minorities in Pakistan would quote his speech that you're free to go to your temple and to your church and whatever. These sorts of things are of course a problem, but at the same time, I wonder whether they could reveal something for you know, be in the genealogy of these ideas. Since in the Middle East, as I pointed out, I think we have different aspects that play an important role, and the outcome seems to be the same. So somehow in the 1980s, we then converge, you know, these two very different trajectories, as Ziauddin Sardar also pointed out, you know, that everyone meets at these conferences. And how did we get there? And is there something to be learned from comparing these cases? Or has maybe sort of the fact that we are, since the 1980s, in there's the same discursive space and people interact with each other and are so much in conversation, has this overshadowed some of these earlier developments? And is it worth to dig into these developments and to see whether we can learn something from this? I'm not sure. What would you think? Since I feel that the discussion on political Islam in the Pakistani context is very much divorced from discussions elsewhere. No, I mean, they're definitely connected. You know, I would even say that some of these moments are connected as well. So, you know, when people talk about 1967 or 1973, I mean, certainly 1973 is something which is directly experienced in Pakistan. So it's you know, the effect of the oil boom, the oil boycott, then this kind of creation of this new Islamic International, you know, the whole Faisal's guys, you know, then incorporating, bringing in Pakistan within that context. I mean, you suddenly have all these things which are named after Faisal, you know, suddenly cropping up all over the place in Pakistan. That element of the 1970s Islamic International in many ways brings Pakistan right into this context of the Middle East. And so, you know, in some cases you start to think, well, you know, is Pakistan not a part of the Middle East? It clearly is in some ways, because it then becomes part of those sorts of conversations. You know, the whole idea of setting up an Islamic university and how these different institutions are linked. You know, how is Kuala Lumpur and Islamabad and others, you know, they're seen as being part of a linked global network and a linked global program. I think that does become a very significant thing which arises out of the 1970s. So in some ways, what I think you then get, and actually the study of the Shia is a good sort of case study which exemplifies it, is that you get a whole set of internationals which develop, which have slightly competing senses of how these things work. They have slightly competing senses of how politics works and how the relationship between state and society works. You know, within the Shia context, you know, everyone talks about the Islamic Revolutionary one with Iran, but then of course you've got the Dawah Party and their kind of networks, and then you've got the Shiraziya and their networks, and there are many other kind of, you could even arguably talk about the different Sufi groups, like the Ne'matullahis. They have their own international networks as well. So these are all competing for very similar but nuanced and different conceptions of how the relationship between kind of deen, state, and society works. And that writ large seems to be the case across the board with, you know, political Islam, state Islam, and different conceptions across the wider Muslim world. So there's that sense in which this very idea of the Muslim world is being constantly recreated. Mm-hmm. And so we've had, you know, the famous argument of, what's his name? Forgetting, The Making of the Muslim World.
Jamal Aydin?
Jamal Aydin, yeah. Jamal Aydin's book. So it's as if, you know, since that pan-Islamist or 19th century moment, this idea of the Muslim world is constantly being recreated. The very fact that people are always talking about who's the influential figure, you know, this kind of crazy Jordanian project of the most influential Muslims, right? That assumes the idea of a Muslim world. And you know, this sort of whole thing about Saudi versus Iran as leading models, again, assumes that there's some sort of unity to this idea of the Muslim world, which requires some sort of headship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, since you speak about this Jordanian project, I mean, it's really interesting how this crops up then on Wikipedia, and I wonder whether people put it themselves on their pages in order to show their importance, if you're mentioned as one of the 500 important Muslims. But since you mentioned the Islamic University as well, what I find striking in this regard is that once again, South Asia is not really there, also playing a very crucial and important role. When you look at how many teachers from Pakistan, you know, scholars went also there to educate Muslim students from all over the world. So their input and how they experienced all of this and what this meant is not really explored. We have good studies now that sort of talk about this cross-pollination of more the Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi ideas intermixed with Wahhabi understandings that were happening there. But the South Asian angle has not so far been looked at. And I would assume that the same applies really also to the Islamic University in Islamabad, which of course gets established to a certain extent much later. If I'm not mistaken, I think it becomes operational in 1985. So 23 years after the Islamic University in Medina. But also what this has meant also for the wider Muslim world, so to speak. I'm not sure. I'm not aware of anything that has really explored what this has meant, this institution.
So isn't it also the case, just to make perhaps an obvious point, which might be clarifying for other people, because some of these things, sometimes hide right before, like the Purloin letter, right before us, before our eyes. Like the Pakistani state is called the Islami Jamhuriya-e-Pakistan, or Iran is called the Islami Jamhuriya, etc. States of the past never had Islamic, right? So there's no Sultanate Islamia or Sultanate Musalmania. So you have Sultanate Taimuriya, for instance, over here in this region. It doesn't, they just don't use that. I mean, it's obviously, if in order to gain legitimacy, if that usage were possible, they would have used it. But that was just not available in that way. Isn't that right? States of the past.
And that just comes back to this whole kind of idea of how the term Islam and Islamic is increasingly used in the modern period is something which is quite distinct. So the very fact that you have you feel the need to qualify something by Islamic becomes something becomes actually a recognition that certain categories and certain disciplines are not ones that you've made, but rather that you're kind of acquiring and coming in from the margin from. So, whether people start talking about Islamic economics, Islamic philosophy, Islamic state, that's because the idea of the state and philosophy and Islam and economics are already givens, right? And they're kind of, you're coming at it at a margin. They're sort of ideas about knowledge that are basically imposed within your context. And then in your desire to live authentically or think through things authentically, you need to find some way of justifying your appropriation of them, right? And that's, I think, why some of these terms, would not make sense in the previous. No one uses the term Islamic philosophy in the pre-modern period. It's extremely, extremely rare. In the same way that I don't think one would necessarily qualify a pre-modern polity with the term Islamic either. But I think there's one comment in the chat which I think is important to it, which is just as we're kind of we do need to pluralize the ways in which Islam is used, and as I said, the Muslim world is recreated constantly. There's even the sense in which the post-colonial state and the post-colonial condition is being constantly recreated as well. So the way in which we understand this, the initial point of the late 1940s to the 1970s to the 1990s, etc. These are very different kind of situations in which one finds itself. The wider issue of neoliberalism within the much later post-colonial state, I think, becomes more and more acute. The questions of how you go about establishing notions of legitimacy become, even more acute within that. And yet, I guess, coming back to your core issue, which about this kind of enduring appeal and success. One word within that, which kind of is the back of it, is this word revolutionary, right? In what sense does the idea of an Islamic state remain revolutionary? Is that central to the appeal?
That's a good point. I think what, while you were speaking, Sajjad, I was also reminded that, and maybe this also ties in with some of the ideas that Nauman raised earlier, I guess some of the studies that would help us to show some of the excesses, or, really to point out what does it mean to Islamize, and why is this still such a purchasing power? It would really be interesting, I think, to have a good study also on the cultural revolution in the context of Iran, where also there was really this effort made to Islamize the university curriculum, to turn these into different institutions. And this has then been buried more or less quietly, but this is also like an aspect, since it was not maybe successful in the long run, hasn't really been looked at in more detail. And maybe this is also something that we could definitely learn from. What does, when you have this sort of approach, or when this is your vision, that there's a form of higher education that could be Islamic and then very different from the secular one, and you sort of quietly have to bury this because you realize it's maybe not something that is really feasible, since there is no Islamic form of engineering, or it's really problematic when you Islamize the social sciences and the humanities.
But that's another good example of the oblivion, because then what happened from about 2007 and 8 is you had this revival of the Islamization of the human sciences and social sciences in Iran. So it's as if that early 80s debate was completely forgotten, right? I mean, this was basically being pushed by Larijani and people who are very close to Khamenei. And the main reason why, the way they kind of packaged it was to say, this is like a really obvious thing. This is the unfulfilled promise of the revolution. We haven't done this. What it actually in practice meant was that it was a very convenient way of targeting people who were politically unacceptable. So it was only departments and people who were considered to be unacceptable who were shifted. It wasn't the case in practice that much changed within university departments in terms of what was being taught, right? So even this kind of ma'arif, curriculum, which is basically the equivalent of what in Pakistan is, I think, Islamiyat, right? The teaching of Islam. That's always been around. That's been around for quite a while in Iran, but it's the way people deal with it and approach it differs dramatically. It's the one class that everyone expects to have a mullah at the front of the class, giving a lecture, and it's the one class which everyone really just doesn't want to be in. But they know they have to because it's kind of required credits, and they don't necessarily take it terribly seriously, but it's there. It's part of the furniture, so to speak. So it's a classic example of not a completely unserious implementation of that Islamization. It's not really rethinking anything. It's just a bit of window dressing, just to kind of legitimize certain sort of things which are going on. And sometimes you even have like parallel situations. So you might have a parallel department which is kind of teaching some sort of Islamized sociology and politics of the world, as opposed to a sociology and politics department which is functioning perfectly reasonably without doing that at all. In the same way, you often have parallel philosophy departments. So you'll have a philosophy department which will not touch anything Islamic, and you'll have an Islamic philosophy department. And that kind of dual track, which became very common in Iran, is actually replicated quite extensively in Turkey. So you see that in the social sciences and humanities in Turkey, that you have this dual track. I'm not familiar with whether that dual track exists in Pakistan, but it's an interesting kind of way in which universities seem to have accommodated this problem by setting up a dual track. I think there's some evidence of it happening even in Malaysia, not in all universities, but in some of the elite, or the serious universities, there's a sense in which there is that parallel track working as well.
Can I ask what they call Islamization in Persian? What's the Persian word for Islamization?
Islamiyat. So it's the same as in the Arabic. So the Islamiyat al-Ma'rifa, Islamiyat al-Ma'rifat, is used in both sense, in both ways. It's
right. Here in Pakistan, of course. So I mean, I often ask my students whenever we come up with one of these conceptual problems, I say, okay, what do you call it in Urdu? Yeah. And then, of course, the answer is you don't call it anything. So Islamization, you can't even, in Urdu, you would say Islamization. You can't say anything else, right? Just like for normal, you don't have a word for normal. In Urdu, you just say normal. Yeah, normal. So Islamization, I mean, that also gives it away, right? I mean, Islamization, it's not even possible to say it even today, after all the, after 40 years of, or however long of efforts of Islamization, there's no word for the term in Urdu.
So maybe I can, because I'm aware we've gone over, well, we've gone on for a while. If I maybe ask this kind of last question to you, Simon. So what do you think will happen? I mean, will this appeal remain? What would have to happen to make people stop, so to speak? What do you think? I mean, or
that's really an unfair question, Sajjad.
Well, okay, let's put it this way. What sort of conditions might change which will make people think more broadly in terms of the political options that are available? I'm not asking you whether we're going to turn to the left or anything like that. I mean, sure. I don't think the left's coming back in any way whatsoever. But you know,
I mean, I just wonder sort of when we see that, some of the major complaints of post-colonial systems are access to justice and, a justice system that delivers for the people. And this is, of course, often and said, one of the reasons, for example, why the Taliban have been so successful in Afghanistan is that they delivered swift and, affordable justice. And I wonder if you would combine this promise with more, a welfare net and accountable leadership, then I wonder what else, what other appeals an Islamic system would have beyond, maybe protecting you against the perceived moral onslaught. But if you have a more liberal system where you could also pursue, if you wish so, a more conservative way of life, then I wonder why this wouldn't be acceptable, really. I mean, you tell me. So but is there, when we look at it more from a humanistic angle, is there really anything more that we should wish for our children, for our families? Is this not like, but that's probably naive.
I think it also presents a conceptual, but that probably has to do with one's own sort of orientation. But as Wittgenstein said, show the fly the way out of the bottle. Yeah, we need a series of philosophical investigations into the usage. Yeah. Into various usages, not just one, various usages, which begin to show the way out of this. It's a bottle, yeah. I mean, it's a conceptual clamp, as Wittgenstein says in another context, yeah. Because of these terms, you can say Islamic, you can use Islam in this particular way. Doesn't mean that it means anything. Yeah, and Wittgenstein, of course, undertakes short, brief reflections, which approach the matter from so many different conceptual angles, intertwined with usage and everyday practice, to show that in fact it's misguiding. It's a philosophy. I mean, it's bad philosophy, in fact. Yeah. So this business about Islamic this and Islamic that and Islamic State, etc., is actually bad modern philosophy. yeah, right, that results in these mental cramps. Yeah.
I mean, the menu of options that you've set forward, Simon, sound great, but they're probably precisely what, for example, the Pakistani political elite would never want. And so at least the appeal to an Islamic state is a nice way for them to not bother doing those things. It's an excuse for them not to do it. So it's easy to talk about the new Medina. It's much more difficult to provide electricity to people and healthcare and simple basic services. Because talking about the new Medina doesn't actually require you to do anything.
Speaking of which, it's actually similar to that other book by Marcus Dexter, The Politics of Self-Expression, his first book, which talks about this experience of Rausch. You're not going to get you're not going to get this experience of Rausch from bread and butter, etc. Although that did happen for a brief period during the Bhutto years, yeah, Roti Kapda aur Makan. That was obviously quite that managed to mobilize a lot of people. I mean, the Islamic socialism, of course, also had consequences, but the main slogan was this Roti Kapda aur Makan.
Cool. Any last thoughts, Simon, before we?
No, thank you. I mean, this has, of course, sort of my presentation has sort of opened the Pandora's box to an extent, and it's also, in some ways, quite depressing that it's not possible to dislodge some of these ideas, or that they are so prevalent and they have such devastating effects for many people, and can be misused, of course, as we all know, in many ways. And I really so I apologize for making us all depressed, and thanks, Sajjad, for raising the flag of hope. And I really hope that in a couple of decades, a new compromise can be found out in order to heal some of these societies where sort of an Islamist version of an Islamic state is really seen as the best possible option for everyone. Hopefully we can come up with some more creative solutions.
No, thank you. And I think that's exactly what some of these kind of, I think, decolonial studies of practice on the ground helps. So that's where, when we had in our previous talks, discussions about sort of local educational initiatives, the way in which people look at issues around gender, etc., on the ground work. I think, even, popular and local kind of Sufi networks and stuff. I mean, I think, I wouldn't say everything is bleak, right? But it's, unfortunately, when you look at the state, you kind of get absorbed into this rather cynical way of looking at the world. But if anything, the idea that there is more to life than the state is actually a really nice way of bringing this to close. So that just leaves it me to thank Simon for this really nice provocation. I think we got a good conversation going. I hope those of you have listened in and will listen to will have found this stimulating, and will have certainly ideas of things to go off and read if you haven't already read, including Simon's own book. Let me just quickly make one final plug before we leave for our next talk, which will return to the Thursday slot. So next Thursday, we'll be back with Najib Jan from Habib, whose the title of his talk is Blasphemy, Biopolitics and Violence in Pakistan. So I apologize for yet another talk about Pakistan, but that's kind of what we've been doing with the South Asian context. But hopefully that will also take us back to this question of, as he calls it, the meta-colonial state and how we deal with that. So please do join us for that conversation next Thursday. So thank you everyone for
Thank you.
and thank you, Simon, again for your talk.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time and yeah, your questions and thoughts.
Thank you.